What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Not too long ago, there was a phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin that lasted over 2 hours. The headlines made it sound like a big diplomatic breakthrough was around the corner, with the American president ready to negotiate peace in Ukraine and maybe even transform the entire geopolitical landscape.
Have agreed to seek a limited ceasefire in Ukraine after holding talks over the phone. The Kremlin has confirmed that the two leaders agreed to pursue a ceasefire on energy and infrastructure targets.
Yet, here we are, reading the fine print, and all we see is that Trump and Putin agreed on almost nothing, except a very vague promise to cease attacks on energy infrastructure of both countries. If you think that sounds like a lousy deal, you're not alone. Even former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, once a huge Trump admirer, said that Putin must be laughing at us for accepting such a meager terms. Because let's face it, a partial ceasefire that only addresses power grids plus a few other polite suggestions does not exactly end a war that has lasted for more than 3 years. In fact, Putin is playing a much bigger game than most people realize. When you look closely, you see a careful strategy aimed at persuading Trump that Ukraine is just a small, inconvenient detail standing in the way of a grander American-Russian partnership. That is the beginning of a trap that Putin sets for the American president. If Trump falls for that story, he might be tempted to lift sanctions or reduce military support to Ukraine. Because, after all, there might be quote-unquote bigger fish to fry. You can probably guess how disastrous that would be, not just for Ukrainians, but for American interests as well. It could drive a wedge between the United States and Europe, unravel the alliances America spent decades building, and leave Trump himself looking very weak, an outcome he claims to hate more than anything else in the world. So today, let's talk about why Putin is so determined to shove Ukraine aside like an annoying mosquito, while dangling the promise of world peace and grand business ventures to the American president. Because that is the real question at the heart of the phone call. To grasp how this trap works, we need to explore the illusions Putin is building, the reality beneath them, and why they should worry everyone who cares about the stable Europe, or, for that matter, a stable world. Let's dive into the chain of events that led us here and see how this deceptive strategy unfolds. To understand how Vladimir Putin manipulates world leaders and why Donald Trump seems receptive to his flattery, you first need to see how the Kremlin frames the conflict in Ukraine. For years now, this war has been ravaging Ukrainian cities, causing thousands of deaths and destabilizing the entire region. You would think any genuine effort to end it would involve carefully negotiated ceasefires, real concessions on both sides, and international oversight to ensure compliance. But that is not how Putin wants us to see it. Instead, he cherry-picks the story, focusing on a narrow concept of halting mutual strikes on energy infrastructure. On the surface, that sounds benevolent. Who does not want to spare civilians from blackouts, freezing temperatures, or a malfunctioning power grid, right? But the moment you look behind that facade, you realize it is the most superficial kind of fix. It does nothing to address Russia's actual military presence in Ukraine, nor does it promise that Russia itself will slow down an invasion that's been so relentless. And even that meager concession still came wrapped in conditions. Russia's government demands that Ukraine accepts a halt on foreign military support, an end to conscription, and a stop to training efforts. And meanwhile, guess what? The Kremlin is not promising the same for itself. There is no hint of Russia withdrawing from Ukrainian territory, no suggesting of halting its own recruitment, and no plan to reduce troop numbers. In other words, Ukraine is expected to tie its own hands, while Russia keeps a tight grip on its arsenal. How about that for a conditional temporary ceasefire? Does not sound like a good deal, right? On top of that, Putin insists that the root causes of the war must be addressed, which is his code for undermining Ukrainian sovereignty altogether. It's like saying, I will let you keep the roof over your head as long as you sign away the land your house stands on. That is the Kremlin trade that Kremlin is offering. If you look back at how Trump approached Ukraine during his time in office, you notice a pattern of wavering. On some days, he hinted he might send lethal defensive aid. On others, he downplayed Russia's aggression altogether.
We are paying disproportionately, and very importantly, if you use Ukraine as an example, and that's a great example, the countries surrounding Ukraine, I mean, they don't seem to care as much about it as we do.
When threatened with new sanctions, Putin simply shrugged and dangled the idea of open-ended cooperation in other domains. That's the real story. The illusion that the war in Ukraine is just a small hurdle blocking the path to grand Russian-American collaboration. But is this actually feasible? As you can guess, not really, because Putin has an entirely different agenda. He wants to carve out more influence in Eastern Europe, maintain his alignment with China, and keep his control over certain energy markets. None of those goals align with the quick and tidy fix in Ukraine. It is easy to see why someone like Trump, who loves to style himself as a deal maker, might fall for the idea that if he just moves past Ukraine, he could achieve sweeping breakthrough in business, global stability, and maybe even a vain dream of reuniting Russia and the West against China. This China. But as we will see, that's not how reality works. And yet, that's precisely the mirage Putin wants him to chase. If you listen carefully to what the Kremlin says, you will hear a very recurring line. Why obsess over Ukraine when you can forge a historic partnership with Russia that would shape the entire planet's future? Putin teases an end to the Middle East's endless turmoil, hints at pressuring Iran to drop its nuclear ambitions, and dangles the prospect of massive American investment in Russian energy projects. He talks about Arctic exploration, global security frameworks, and even the most seducing idea of blocking China's expansion. Trump would love it, wouldn't he? The promise is clear. Pave the way for Russia and America to stand side by side, and you will rewrite the rules of international politics. But let's be brutally honest here. These so-called bigger fish are largely illusions. For one thing, Russia's reliance on China is so deep that it cannot just get up and break its ties to Beijing because Putin sweet talks Trump on the phone. Russia needs China's vast markets for its energy exports, as well as its investments in diplomatic support. The moment Putin tries to pivot away, he would lose a critical economic lifeline, especially given the Western sanctions already strangling Russian trade. On top of that, Russia's leverage over Iran is far more limited than the Kremlin likes to pretend. And I mean, sure, they can sell arms and exert some influence, but expecting Russia to strong-arm Iran into giving up nuclear ambitions is as naive at best and as delusional at worst. And then there is the notion that American companies could run wild in Russia, exploring natural gas in the Arctic or investing heavily in Russian businesses. You can see why Trump, perpetually fascinated by big dollar signs, might find that extremely tempting. But let's remember who is in charge. A leader who has systematically run down the rule of law, seized assets when it suited him, and turned the Russian economy into his personal bank account. If you think foreign investors will find a stable environment under those conditions, you should take a long, hard look at how other businesses have fared there. The list of foreign entrepreneurs who had their assets confiscated or found themselves under suspicious legal assault is long enough to scare off any investor who is not blinded by dreams of quick profits. Of course, Trump might imagine that he has the charisma and the deal-making talent to tame Putin. But anybody who has paid attention to global events knows that a handshake in front of cameras does not essentially change the reality of entrenched power structures. Putin's top priority is staying in control, and to do that, he needs to keep his economy afloat through any means necessary, including doubling down on Chinese partnerships. Throwing open the gates for an American business invasion is not on his agenda, unless it serves his own interests. So whenever you hear talk of bigger fish, just remember that the Kremlin is presenting fantasies. The more Trump chases them, the more he risks sacrificing Ukraine and American credibility for nothing substantial in return. Whenever the conversation about Trump and Putin drifts towards possible deals, there is one essential factor that often gets overlooked: Europe. Most Europeans are fully aware of the threat Russia possesses to Ukraine and, by extension, to the rest of the continent. They have seen how the West's united stance, no matter how shaky at times, has helped keep some limits of Russian ambitions. Economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and military support to Ukraine have forced Russia to at least moderate some of its actions, even if that moderation has been painfully slow. Now imagine what happens if Trump decides to ease off. Suppose he lifts or weakens sanctions on Moscow to show goodwill, or perhaps he unilaterally reduces military backing to Ukraine, believing that America can afford to disengage from other people's problems. This might not happen right now or within even next couple of weeks, but what if Putin keeps going back and forth with Trump for months? Will American president have the patience to continue dealing with Putin, or will he simply shrug away and say, "You guys, whatever, you guys deal with your own problems, I'm out of here, good luck"? The immediate consequence would be a dramatic escalation of tensions between America and European countries that see Russia's behavior in Ukraine as an existential security threat. Europe has poured resources into stabilizing Ukraine, both financially and militarily, because it understands that a destabilized Eastern Europe is a ticking time bomb at the Europeans' doorstep. If Trump abandons that stance, you might see European leaders outright refuse to follow along. And suddenly, the NATO alliance, one of the cornerstones of European security, begins to show cracks. And not the superficial kind that can be plastered over with a few nice speeches. No, these would be serious divisions that enemies of the West, not just Russia, would eagerly exploit. Even those Europeans who once admired Trump for his straight talk or business talent could turn on him if they believe he is undermining continental security. We have already heard leaders once again like Boris Johnson, who once held a positive view of Trump, voice their very big disapproval. Others in Europe, especially in places like Poland or the Baltic states, will feel even more endangered if America signals any willingness to hand Moscow a victory in Ukraine. So, if Trump is trying to boost America's status on the world stage, the surest way to do exactly the opposite is to give Russia a free pass in Eastern Europe. He would not only isolate America from its closest allies, he would also confirm that suspicion that the United States is unreliable when it comes to defending smaller nations. And that, in the long run, is a gift to adversaries like China, which would be thrilled to see fracturing alliances among Western powers. From the European perspective, the biggest worry is that Trump's fascination with grand deals blinds him to the extremely minor but equally important details of a conflict that demands careful diplomacy. Ukraine is not some pawn you casually sacrifice to keep an imagined bigger alliance with Russia afloat. European leaders understand that letting Ukraine crumble sends a message that sovereignty and territorial integrity can't be trampled by any stronger neighbor, not even just on the European continent. That is the kind of precedent Europe, and pretty much any other country, would like to avoid at all costs. For a man who brags about never wanting to look weak, Donald Trump should pay very close attention to caving in to Vladimir Putin's demands. There is no shortage of parallels here, whether you think back to the hasty American withdrawal from Afghanistan under his successor, or the countless times strongmen have used superficial concessions to outmaneuver presidents who crave a quick deal. The situation in Ukraine demands commitment, patience, and a willingness to play the long game. All attributes that do not exactly align with Trump's style of immediate gratification. If he rushes to an arrangement with Putin in hopes of scoring a big public relations victory, it could blow up in his face sooner than he starts to tackle the next problem on his to-do list: The comedic element here is that Trump sees himself as a born negotiator, a person who can handle world leaders the way he used to handle real estate moguls back in his times. But geopolitics is not the same as cutting a real estate deal. In real estate, both sides often want to finalize something profitable, or at least move on from a stalemate. In the high-stakes arena of war and peace, you are dealing with a leader who has carefully crafted a narrative of his country encircled by hostile powers, and who is more than willing to use disinformation, military aggression, and economic warfare to achieve his goals. Putin is not impressed by a flurry of phone calls or public recognition. He will wait patiently for the moment Trump overplays his hand, and then he will collect his price, which is less Western support for Ukraine, reduced sanctions, and a freer pathway to expand Russia's influence. That's precisely why this phone call and the half-hearted ceasefire arrangement it tried to produce are so dangerous. If Trump genuinely believes that forging a bigger, better relationship with Putin is worth sacrificing Ukraine, then we might see him systematically dismantle the strong Western consensus that has kept the Kremlin somewhat in check. In that scenario, Ukraine's best-case outcome is a drawn-out conflict with diminishing foreign aid. The worst case is an eventual capitulation if the pressure becomes unbearable. And that leads us right back to the image of Trump as a leader who gave Russia everything it wanted while getting next to nothing in return, which is a textbook definition of looking weak. Well, right out, guys, if you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in